Well, I was doing what I do every morning, which is read yesterday's news. I read the newspaper. And I was by myself, and the phone rang, which is unusual at that hour of the morning. Being in the Midwest, we're an hour earlier, right? Yeah. And so it was my sister, hysterical on the phone, saying, "They've attacked the Pentagon." I said, They attacked what? The Pentagon? I thought she was telling me about a TV show or something. I don't know. So I turned on the TV and I saw what was going on. And, it felt, of course, as if the whole nation was vulnerable at that moment. And my husband and son were working at the Board of Trade that day in downtown Chicago. And my fear was that this was the prelude to some bigger attack that, you just didn't know where it would end. And so they evacuated all the important buildings in Chicago that might be targets, and they got home around noon. And, in those hours of worrying about them coming home, it was very real what was happening.
I remember the day incredibly well. I was at the post office in Lincoln Park mailing some things for Genesis at the Crossroads, and someone in the post office said something, and my brother worked on the 40th floor of Tower 2 of the World Trade Center, so this was incredibly personal for me. And 3 months earlier, my mother had died, so this was a really, really difficult year already, and there was a lot of family loss. And I got back home, and at the time there was a co-presidency in Genesis at the Crossroads, and I'm Jewish, and the co-president was Palestinian American. And we were on the phone just watching the news, just sobbing together. And it was about 6 hours before I could actually find out that my brother was alive. And that between my two brothers, who both worked in the financial district, they lost one friend. And this was a person who was at his first day of work and had a 6-month-old child of the child that was youngest. And actually, even talking about it, I can feel the emotion of the day. I mean, it was just so draining. And I think one of the things I really had a thought about is, here I am working on an organization to use art and education to bring people together. And is this just a spit in the bucket? Is this really doing anything? Am I having my own little moment of existential angst about what's really happening and the power of one, and do we really have that?
So I immediately flipped on the TV, which we had in the kitchen, and started watching and saw the whole thing unfold at that time. Unlike some of you, I had no personal connection. Here I was living in Chicago, away from that event. And so I sort of went to, oh my goodness, this is horrible, but it's distant, that we're a much bigger country than just this happening. I didn't take it personal, and I started wondering, well, who were these people that did this? And so I think my focus was wondering how on earth this was accomplished, who did this, and why, and who could hate us that much.
I was out of the house when the attack took place, and I walked in just as the aircraft that flew into the second building was on the screen. And my wife was hysterical in her own way. And it had that dreamlike quality. That it's not one of those, well, it can't be happening here, but that almost the sense it's a waking nightmare. And I've seen a lot of things in my life. I've seen a lot of death in my life. But I can't say that at that moment that registered. And then when the discussions began on the estimates of the dead, that seemed to me to be such an affront that we're talking about the numbers of dead, when behind that are your friends and mine. And all I could think of in that was that that's almost indecent to think in those terms. And I was really thinking about my close friends in Pakistan and in Egypt, all Muslims. And I thought, man, what's going to happen to them? And we're finding out, you know.
I was living in the South Loop in Chicago, but I'm from New York, and my mom and my sister were still in New York, and as soon as we saw what was happening on television, I remember hearing that it was a small plane at first. That it was like it was a single prop plane. I remember, and so that story kind of started to form in my head, and then eventually we turned on the television and watched things unfold, and I couldn't get my mom on the phone. It was before cell phones, and or for us anyway, and so that was worrying, and after a while, you know, there was a loop of the news going over and over and over, and I took the dogs out, and I sat in a wild space which used to be down in the South Loop. There was a big area of land that was undeveloped, where there were a couple of shacks that were built and were being lived in, and there's some coyotes out there, and lots of rabbits. And I sat there, and it's next to the tracks, and I just watched Chicago empty of people, and that was the predominant experience of it. Was just kind of like a deflating, like there something had been revved up with the cycle of that image of this horror. And then I kind of sat in the world and watched. In the shadow of the Sears Tower, which I thought was probably our most likely target here in Chicago, and I just watched these completely plane-free skies.
I was staying with my then girlfriend, the woman who's now my wife. How did it work? I was getting ready to go off to seminary, and I was sort of between apartments. So I was staying with her for 2 or 3 weeks. Hadn't started school yet, and I was just, the job had ended. And anyway, so I had leisure time. And I had started watching the morning shows again, something I don't really do when I'm working. And so I was on her couch, and the TV's on, and I'd turn it on as the news commentator is fumbling for words. It's such a rare experience to witness someone who speaks for a living like that, to fumble for vocabulary. And there's this picture of the towers, and it's still really early on. There's just smoke coming out of one. And they're not sure, and there's a speculation about single prop or whatever. And Trish is getting ready. I started yelling down the hall to come in and look at what was going on. It was just, at the time, it really was just this single prop. They were speculating and speculating. And Trish walked in the room at the exact moment that the second plane hit. And we just stood there, awed. We were living in Rogers Park, a North Side neighborhood in the city, and Trish worked right there in the neighborhood, so she did go to work. And we were just calling people, and I spent the day on the phone just making phone calls. I have lots of family in Northern Virginia, and so we wanted to make sure everyone was okay there after the Pentagon. Had friends in New York. A friend who was visiting me today, actually, was working 12 blocks away when everything happened, and was in the streets when the buildings collapsed. So those close images of the clouds chasing people down the streets. In my imagination, Teresa's in the middle of all that. She called me later that day to say she was all right. But 1,000 questions running through my head. Everything from just, the hatred, the comeuppance. What did we do? People don't do stuff like this for no apparent reason. Even if it's an insane reason, there's reason. And then just wondering, because they start talking about this stuff so quickly, and it is sort of an affront, whether it's the numbers or the question, is this going to be an event that shapes a generation? And oh, good God, can we just stay in the moment? As awful as the moment is, can we stay in the moment? Because and I have found myself after 20 minutes of it turning off the TV because they kept running that same 30 seconds of footage, and once was plenty. But that question of is this the thing that's going to define a generation? I don't know. That's what ran through me, and 3 weeks later we started seminary. And entering class, and at the opening liturgy, the homiletics professor got up and he had to preach, and he had no choice but to talk about this event, and then to ask all of us as we're entering into vocational or professional Christians, whatever, how do you want to understand what you do? There are thousands of years worth of history to unpack to understand the single event, and it's going to be your job to make sense of it. And that stayed with me. Yeah.
9/11, at that time, it's 2001, I owned a coffee house. So I owned my own business, and I live in Beverly Hills on the south side of Chicago, and the coffee house was there, and I happened to be home that day, and I had the TV on, and I never had the TV on in the morning. It was just weird that I had the TV on CNN. And so I watched the whole thing unfold as it happened. And like Phyllis, I was kind of analytical about it. Wasn't emotional about it. I just, what, why, and who, and it could have been because I tend to, like you're saying about the media, I hate being emotionally manipulated, when they start telling you how you're supposed to be feeling. So I just probably didn't feel at all because I just didn't want to be, the media to be telling me how I should be responding to this. So what was eerie for me was my house is in line with the planes that go to Midway Airport. And to go outside and see this empty sky where there was no air traffic at all. And it was so quiet. That really brought it home. That something huge. I mean, you'd think it would be enough that what I saw was on television, but when they landed 5,000 or so planes at once, that really brought it home. And then I know we're supposed to be talking about what happened that day, but it really hit home when I went into work the next morning, and even the regulars in my cafe walked in, did not say a word. They didn't say good morning. They didn't talk about it. They walked in and they got their coffee and they left. That was really something. The really chatty ones didn't say anything. So it slowly started to, I started to, feel it. Yeah.
And I suddenly heard the phone ring. We also thought it was odd that someone calling me mid-morning like that. And it was my son, my oldest son, Josh. I said, "Dad, turn on the TV." I turned it on. And he said, this is amazing. Now, we were at the point where one jet had hit the building, and there was still discussion as to whether or not it was an accident. And the newscaster saying, well, could this be an accident? Could it be? There was some discussion. Someone had gone mad and had flown a plane into the building. And I think there had been another report the previous week or something like that, about someone who had flown a plane strangely. So is this another one of those incidents? And then while I'm on the phone, the second plane flies into the building. And then the newscaster say, well, this is definitely an attack. We're under attack. And I remember my son saying to me, he said, this is for us, Dad, what the Kennedy assassination was for you guys. This is our marker of the generation. So it was my kid, he was saying, he was already thinking in those terms. And I remember feeling just stunned, what, and I was saying to Suzanne the other day, as we began to think about the implications of this, I thought I had a kind of strange, unexpected reversal of my feelings about the election. Because the election results were in, right? This was Bush now had won, and I felt he had stolen the election from the Democratic candidate. Not he personally, but that it was really had been taken away from the Democrats who should have won. But I was happy that he was there. I was happy that there was I'm being honest, that there was a kind of a war hawk. I thought I'm not sure that the other candidate would have been ready to deal with this. And so my first response, later it changed, but my first response was, we need someone strong now in making a response to this. And wondering what I could do. I mean, I haven't had feelings of patriotism for a long time in this country. As I grew up, I was part of the hippie generation. I grew a beard, and I smoked pot, and did all the things that Clinton did. and then yet here I was feeling these strange feelings of patriotism. I'm feeling like, can I join up and help to talk and discuss, and we have to defend our country. I mean, we're under attack. This is something new in my experience. For me, this is entirely new. Where the country's under attack. We'd never been under attack before. My whole life, the United States has never been under attack. This is something brand new. So I just kind of went with those things. Then things began to change as the commentary came in the next couple of days. But those were my initial feelings. Yeah.
On the Sunday before, we had the first faith walk in Northbrook. It's never happened before. And since we're the only mosque in Northbrook, there are many synagogues. We have a good relationship with them. In fact, one of the synagogues, which is half a mile south of us, use our facilities to do their worship for 8 months, not too long before that. And the people were coming in. There were a lot of people coming to the mosque. And some of the people I knew from Interfaith, they were surprised that many people are coming to the mosque. Well, I said, I have a simple explanation, because there's only one mosque in Northbrook, and people are coming in want to know what goes on in the mosque. Of course, everybody would go to the mosque. And the other reason for doing that, because going to the mosque was the last place in the touring the other houses of worship. And if you make it to the mosque, you get a prize, and the prize was that you would get a pizza. Not from us, from another vendor. So we were really enjoying the fact that there's been a lot of people coming in, and our interfaith relationship, it seems to be working well, and until that Tuesday. Now, normally, I have lecture to give. It so happens that somebody else was going to replace me for other reason. We have a change in the curriculum. So we have a basic scientists give their lectures, and then a clinical person gives the lecture. And normally we sit in one another's lectures just to see what goes on. This time, he felt that I've heard him before. There's no reason for me to come early, because the class starts at 8 o'clock, and I'm in Mundelein. You have to leave at 6:30 to get down there by 8. So I had the luxury of watching television, and I was watching Diane Sawyer on Channel 7. and we were having breakfast, and I saw the image of the first plane. And for me, it was very shocking, because you have to remember that as an immigrant to this country, nobody invited me to come here. I did. And I became citizen in 1963. And I love this country. I want to go to the Army to serve. They told me that you're classification 5, and the people in the Army headquarters laughed at me and said, everybody wants to get out of Army. What are you doing? Want to get into the Army? I said, well, I never served in armed forces. I want to do something. They said, well, you're doing something. And we sat down there, my wife and I, and they started gazing at this building. The building had a meaning for us, because in 1983, prior to going to Germany on a Fulbright, we went to New York, visiting New York. I have actually studied at Columbia University in New York, so I knew New York very well. And we went to the top of this building and took pictures from the top and the bottom. And we have a copy of those pictures. It was kind of like you're living in an illusion. It hit us very hard. Could not figure out who could have done that in his right mind. And then, of course, watching people jumping off, and then the building fall apart.
I got to work by 8 o'clock or earlier, so it was really early. There was only one other person in the office at that point. And for whatever reason, he was aware that something had happened. So we had, where I work, they had all these overhead TV sets. So he turned on one of the TV sets. And so when I walked in, there was the image of that first plane hitting the first tower. And like so many have said, it was like, well, what? A plane hit the tower, the World Trade Center? And and I thought it was, a single engine plane, some kind of a small, and, somebody had made a horrible mistake and hit the tower, which sometimes happens. But of course, so it was just me and this other guy, and then slowly the office started filling up as people came to work. Nobody got farther than the TV. That was the overhead TV, and at that point there were several overhead TVs on, and we just watched over and over those images that are on the newspapers. The other tower gets hit, the flames, the explosion, and then people jumping out of the tower, and it just gets more and more and more incredible. That went on for maybe 2 hours as people just entered the office and just stood looking, and nobody had anything to say. Then finally, it was like, something has to go. Are we going to work today? But also, our friends. I tried to reach my daughter. That what's going on? I mean, the school. It looked like things were starting to be canceled. Finally, she calls me at some point. She gets through, and she's in tears, and she says, "Are we at war, Dad?" And it was that moment of listening to her, 15-year-old. It was just her and I. Her mother, my wife, had died of cancer about a year earlier than that, so it was still very early in this era of us, being a two-person family, and this was a remarkable thing that just, are we at war, Dad? And I still think about just the anguish in her voice. I had some other friends call me. My sister called and said, well, this used to be a free country. And we, what's going to happen next? Eventually, it was like the work was canceled. We all went home. I mean, there was I wasn't in the newsroom. There was a skeleton crew at the Tribune newsroom that put out a newspaper. I worked at the Syndicate, and basically work was canceled for that day. I went home. I picked up my daughter. Got to my car, picked up my daughter at school, and it was just. I felt like a zombie. I mean, what is going on? It just was something, the bottom of my certainty on where I live just fell out. We watched TV at home. Eventually, my sister-in-law, my mother-in-law, some of us sort of gathered together, and just kind of, I felt the need to be close to the people that I loved. It was just it was beyond words. It was just beyond words. I remember shortly after having this thought as I was taking the train to work, which I normally did, there was a bag of, like a McDonald's bag that somebody had abandoned on the seat, and I'm thinking, well, this is what a terrorist would do. They'd put a bomb in there, something you wouldn't suspect. And I've gone, boy, that is a weird thought. And my friend Ray Parrish, who was going to be here today, but wound up having a severe cold that kept them away, has talked about how he thinks everybody kind of began to suffer from PTSD. And but I think for me, what drove it home was finally reaching my daughter in tears, wanting to know what had happened, and said, "Are we at war, Dad?" And I didn't know what to say.